On Saturday the 4th of April 1931, the body of 73-year-old Minnie Dilley was found in her home in 40 Fort, Pennsylvania. It was a brutal and senseless killing, one that shook the local community to its core and had the police desperately searching for answers. There were no signs of struggle, and nothing was taken from the home. For a while, people wondered whether the horrifying crime would remain unsolved. That was until a shocking arrest led to tabloid tales of a supposed witchcraft murder mystery and plans for a cult that had eventually led to homicide. Now, these were salacious headlines that were certain to sell a lot of newspapers, and they definitely kept readers gripped, but the story behind the headlines was far more real and much more disturbing. So join me as we investigate the so-called love cult murder of Minnie Dilley. This video is brought to you by viewer support on Patreon. You can join for £3 a month, which will give you early access to videos and access to our Discord server. On other tiers, you get access to Patreon-only podcasts and videos. So what are you waiting for? Find the link in the description and sign up today.
My love, she speaks like silence.
So before we begin talking about the case, I really want to tell you more about the woman at the centre of it. Minnie Dilley was the firstborn child of Eliza and Anning Dilley. She was born on August 25th, 1857 in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and she was one of 4 children. Her siblings, Jessie and Carrie, died in the late 1800s, but her brother Sherman lived to the ripe old age of 101, eventually passing away in 1966. Minnie's great-great-grandfather was Richard Dilley, who had fought in the Revolutionary War. He had moved the family from Cape May, New Jersey, to Luzerne County, Pennsylvania in 1784, and the Dilleys had resided there ever since. Her grandfather Jesse was a well-known meat dealer and cattle buyer, and he and his wife Mary had 10 children. Personally, I can't imagine having one child, let alone having to look after 10 of them. But admittedly, the family seemed to be well off, so they were most likely able to afford help when it came to raising the children. According to his obituary, few men were better or more favourably known than Millie's father Anning. He worked in the meat business with his dad before moving into public service. He became a city assessor and was president of the city council in Wilkes-Barre. Her mother, Eliza, was a member of the Sunday School of the First Methodist Episcopal Church for over 50 years. They provided their daughter Minnie with a good education. She went to school in Wilkes-Barre before becoming a student at Cazenovia College in New York. She lived with her mother, Eliza, in Wilkes-Barre up until her death in 1914. And with the family inheritance, she decided to move to the nearby borough of 40 Fort.
40 Fort, Pennsylvania, one of the great towns. You know who started in 40 Fort, Pennsylvania?
What?
You'll be surprised. The Keystone Cops. Originally, the old Black Diamond Theater was there in 40 Fort, Pennsylvania, up near Wilkes-Barre, up in the Wyoming Valley. It's a great little Pennsylvania town.
In typical 1930s fashion, she was described as being skilled in crafts ordinarily followed by men. According to reports, she was an amateur architect and a skilled carpenter. This eventually led to her designing her own home at 98 River Street. The newspapers would later describe the house as both artistic and pretentious. Minnie was a keen book reader and writer herself. She designed the home to have ample storage space for her book collection, and she even had her own library room. Honestly, if I was ever in the position of being able to design my own home, I would literally design everything around my books. There would be bookcases here, there, and bloody everywhere. The press seemed to sensationalize Minnie's home at every turn. Everything about it was open to speculation, from the books she read to the tchotchkes that adorned her fireplace. It was almost as if they were looking for clues in every inch of the house. They even wrote that a statue of Eros, the god of love, sat proudly on the mantle. But that's a claim that I could never confirm, as the only photograph of Minnie's fireplace only only shows half of it. But it is a detail that they latched onto, and you will soon see why. Minnie also paid considerable attention to home security. Every entrance door on the first floor of the home actually had 2 doors. The inner door would open towards whoever was in the house, so that when they opened it, they could actually see who was outside before opening the second door to let them in. According to her friends, Minnie would never open the door in the daytime unless she recognized the person at the door. And at night, she would make sure that she recognized the caller's voice before opening up. Her neighbours would note that she always kept her curtains drawn at night, and her doors and windows were always securely locked. But that just seems like normal behaviour, and it's hard to tell whether Minnie did that out of any anxiety or fear. Probably important to bear in mind that all of the reports and information I had to go on were written after her murder, and the newspapers probably wanted to ham up this idea that she was afraid. She was a woman living alone, and it's really not surprising that she wanted to make sure that her home was secure. Now, I'm also unsure what Minnie did for work, as it was never listed in any of the newspaper articles on her death or any of the census records that I could find using Ancestry. As far as I could tell, she cared for her elderly parents and then made the move to Fortyford. Some of the newspapers claimed that her inheritance had allowed her to commission the building of several small cottages next to her own home. These same reports said that Minnie had rented them out and that she was a landlord. But again, I couldn't verify that that was actually true, but it will come up again later. Now, back in the 1930s, no matter how socially active you were, if you were unmarried, then you'd be described as a spinster. Right? Eleanor Rigby style. You can have an address book that was totally full up with mates, right? You're absolutely like brimming full of pals. You got a stacked diary every single week, and people would still look at you with a mixture of sympathy and amazement when you told them that you weren't married. I bring this up because the newspaper descriptions of Minnie Dilley's social life were really quite contradictory. She was described as a recluse, but records show her being incredibly hands-on in multiple different society groups. She was most notably the treasurer of the Wilkes-Barre district of the Women's Home Missionary Society, which was part of the Methodist Church. The papers wrote that she had independent ideas, but they didn't elaborate on what they were. Perhaps the mere act of being an unmarried woman and living alone was seen as an independent idea back then. Despite the paper's insistence on painting her as a kind of hermit, Minnie had plenty of friends, and her neighbours were familiar with her comings and goings, so much so that when nobody was able to get hold of her for a day, people began to worry.
Williams and Zinger killed poor Hattie Carroll with a cane.
On the evening of Thursday, the 2nd of April 1931, Minnie Dilley had left her home to attend a dinner party at the home of the Johns family in town. While she was gone, Mrs. L.G. Swetland, the president of the Women's Home Missionary Society, had called Minnie to discuss the annual anniversary of their group, which was to be held the next day. That wasn't the first time that Mrs. Swetland had called. She'd attempted the previous night too and received no answer. So again, it appears that Minnie, the so-called recluse, was out and about and had missed the call. And back in the day, there was no such thing as a voicemail service. Mrs. Swetland decided to get in touch with Minnie's nephew, Anning, to see if he'd heard from her. But when she finally managed to get hold of him, he said that he'd heard nothing. She was clearly concerned, and Anning quickly sprung into action. He allegedly made his way to Minnie's home on Friday evening, knocked on the door and waited for her to open it. But there was no response. No stirring from inside the home. There was nothing. So he did the only thing that he could think to do. He left a card under the door, asking Minnie to get in contact with him, and left. By the time Saturday evening rolled around, with no word from Minnie, Anning had had enough. Sure, she might enjoy spending some time alone, but nobody had heard from her in 3 days. This was unusual, and it was definitely a cause for concern. When Anning arrived at her home that evening and knocked on the door, there was no answer yet again. But this time, he didn't just walk away. He borrowed a flashlight from her next door neighbour, and to his surprise, he found the door on the south side of her home had been left unlocked. Now, Minnie was usually scrupulous about the security of her home, and here was one of her doors left open. It wasn't a good sign. But as Anning entered the house, he had no idea that he'd be walking straight into a crime scene. He found Minnie lying motionless by the fireplace in the living room. She'd been attacked by somebody wielding some kind of weapon. They'd hit her over the head several times, and they had then used a sharp weapon to inflict even more damage. According to the newspaper reports, they had actually tried to decapitate her. Anning immediately fled the property, heading straight to the police station to report what he had found. On his way there, he came across Patrolman Smith, who just so happened to be en route to Minnie's home. As it turned out, concerned neighbours had got in contact with him and asked him to investigate her disappearance. Now, here he was running straight into Anning. What were the chances? The two of them went back to the 44th Borough Hall, where Anning told him of the horrifying scene that he had discovered. After taking down his statement, Patrolman Smith notified the state police, and they both made their way back to the house. Every room of Minnie's home, apart from the living room, was described as orderly. Her bed was prepared, and there were zero signs of robbery, as well as no indication that she had struggled with her attacker. The police initially hypothesized that she had been sitting in her rocking chair in front of the fireplace and had been attacked from behind. If that were true, then it would mean that she had left the door unlocked, which seems hard to imagine considering what we know about her. In the initial reports, the police did say that there was a possibility that she could have been standing when she was attacked. This would later be confirmed. They also discovered the weapon that was used to attack Minnie. It was a simple glass bottle of ginger ale, and it had been hidden around the side of the house. As for the weapon used in the attempted decapitation, they hypothesized that the murderer had tossed it into the river that ran behind Minnie's home. When the coroner eventually examined her body, he deemed that she had been dead for around 48 hours. They discovered an unread Friday morning newspaper inside the home, and the Saturday newspaper was left on the front porch. They assumed that she had taken the Friday newspaper inside and was killed shortly thereafter. In the immediate aftermath of Minnie's murder, rumours began to circulate in regards to a motive. The newspapers reported that a diary had been found in her home. They spoke of a particular entry in which Minnie expressed being afraid of someone that she had loaned money to. For a few days, the press jumped on this story of a supposed revenge murder. They wrote stories about Minnie's fortune and heavily implied that although nothing had been stolen, her finances somehow played a part in her tragic end. She was described as having sharp business dealings with others, and was supposedly a woman who paid her bills and expected the same payment of money owed to her. But if money was a motive, how come nothing in the home was taken? It was a theory that didn't add up, and the police quickly got to work on shutting down the rumour mill. They told the press that the last entry of Minnie's diary was made in 1921, so whatever was happening then really had no bearing on what had occurred a decade later. And the overall tone and feel of her diary entries were described as being good-natured. However, Minnie's diary wasn't the only rumoured piece of evidence. Now, some somehow word had gotten out that a threatening letter was found in the pocket of the dress that Minnie was wearing when she was found. And that wasn't all. She had apparently been receiving multiple letters of a threatening nature for quite some time. She had even gone to the postal inspectors and demanded an investigation, but nothing had happened, and the letters kept coming. The police kept quiet for a few days. All they said was that Minnie kept all of her correspondence and that these records were being investigated. But then, on the 9th of April, they finally made a shocking arrest.
Mrs. Frances Thompson, 29, minister's daughter, former Wellesley College student, and a school teacher here, left Pittsburgh today in the custody of Luzerne County detectives, who will take her to Wilkes-Barre for questioning in the murder of Miss Minnie Dilley, 74.
It's a hard rains are gonna fall.
Frances Thompson was born on the 13th of February 1899 in Wisconsin. Her father was a former pastor at the First Baptist Church in Pittsburgh, and in 1917 the family took in a lodger, Carl Thompson, who had moved to the US from Denmark. Carl and Frances fell for each other and were married in her parents' home on July 26, 1921. In Pittsburgh, she worked as an English teacher at Latimer High School, but they soon moved to Forty Fort, where Carl worked as a lumber salesman, and Frances got another job as an English teacher. Together, they had 3 young children. Much like Minnie, Frances was well educated and had attended Wellesley College in Massachusetts, where she had graduated in 1921. The newspapers at the time seemed to delight in writing about her physical appearance. She was both extremely attractive, but also a pathetic picture. She walked with a limp due to a paralytic stroke that she had had as a child. The press reported that she was self-conscious about it and was known to carry a newspaper or magazine against her hip to try and conceal the limp. The press reported that she had large brown eyes and that one of them contained a cast which draws the optics slightly to one side. As you can tell, they were very particular when it came to describing the way that she looked. It was alleged that the residents of Forty Fort had deemed her peculiar. She was an eccentric who kept to herself. But again, these are descriptions from newspaper reports, and we have no record of people talking about her before Minnie's murder. Her husband Carl was described as a genius along electrical lines. Some reports claimed that he had a radio laboratory in the attic of their house, which just so happened to be directly across from Minnie Dilley's. In fact, it was reported that the house the Thompsons rented actually belonged to Minnie and that she was their landlord. Now again, I have to say that I haven't been able to independently verify that she was the Thompsons' landlord, but that seemed to be what everyone was saying. There were initial reports that Minnie had criticised Frances's housekeeping abilities, and this had caused serious tension between the two of them.
Housekeeping still remains the most important business of the world. It engages the hearts and minds of more people and calls for higher qualities than any other occupation.
But a much stranger story was soon to be revealed. From what I could piece together, it seemed that Minnie had been having trouble with her radio, and she'd asked Frances's husband Carl if he could fix it for her. According to the local press, Carl had made frequent visits to Minnie's home to repair the radio, but how frequent these actually were is anyone's guess. I mean, you could pop round someone's house like 3 times in the space of a week, and that would be classed as frequent. But if you only ever visited those 3 times, does that make you a frequent visitor? These are all questions to ponder. Frances claimed that she had found Minnie in her home and she began to suspect an affair. According to her, Minnie's subtle influence had eventually cost her her job at the school in Forty Fort. Now again, this was an allegation that never appeared to be backed up by any evidence. But if Minnie really did cost Frances her job at the school, then perhaps it was for good reason.
I decided to have him arrested and I went looking for a cop.
On Wednesday the 8th of April, the investigation into Minnie's murder had led the Assistant District Attorney of Luzerne County, Donald Coughlin, along with County Detective John Dempsey and Sergeant Norman Anich, directly to the city of Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh town is a smoky old town, Pittsburgh.
They began by bringing in Francis's husband Carl for questioning, but they soon realised that it was actually his wife that they were after. Francis was detained and questioned in Pittsburgh, where she gave a strange and detailed report of her movements between Wednesday the 1st and Saturday the 4th of April. She claimed that she had taken her 4 children, Francis, Carl and Elvira, to the home of a child carer named Mrs. Margaret Dietz. She had told Margaret that she had no money to give her up front, but that she'd be back on Saturday with the payment. She even handed over her sewing machine as a kind of security deposit. At the home that she shared with Carl, she had left him a typewritten note telling him that she had taken the children on a vacation, despite disappearing by herself. After dropping the children off with the caretaker, she claimed that she did the following. On Wednesday, I read a paper in a drugstore near Edward Street for a while. Then I went window shopping downtown and spent the night at the Pennsylvania Railroad station reading papers and magazines. On Thursday, I walked to the bridge at the foot of Rosenbaum's store and then went to the Employment Bureau in the Bessemer building asking for a job. They had nothing for me. I went to Rosenbaum's restroom and tried to work afterwards at Frank and Cedars. I spent all night at the Pennsylvania station. On Friday, I had breakfast in a restaurant on Liberty Avenue and took the streetcar to Highland Park. I rode to the end of the line and then rested in the park. I took a car downtown and went to Joseph Horn's, window shopped for a while, had dinner and went to Pennsylvania Station for the night. Then on Saturday, I walked through Shenley Park and took the streetcar to East Liberty. I window shopped at the stores in the East End and then I returned to Mrs. Dietz where I called for the children at 6:30 p.m. and then went home. Assistant DA Coughlin told the press,
"We're not on any wild goose chase, and as soon as we have checked the woman's statements, we're going to rush right back to Wilkes-Barre with her."
It was a bizarre story that Francis gave to the police, and one that didn't seem to check out at all when they began to investigate. She hadn't left her name at any of the businesses she claimed to have visited looking for work, and nobody there recognised her. When the authorities confronted her with these facts, she seemed to stick to her story and was adamant that she was not guilty of any crime. According to her, she hadn't been anywhere near Minnie Dilley's home. However, she did reveal some interesting information. According to Francis, her husband Carl was planning to have her committed to a psychiatric facility, and that's why she'd left the house and tried to secure work. It was a charge that Carl denied, although he did admit to having concerns about his wife's behaviour, and he said that she would often disappear for days at a time. He also told the authorities that she had been struggling with hallucinations for the past 3 years, and that she often described these as hearing strange voices from the air. Now, obviously, this points towards Francis having some form of mental illness, be it schizophrenia, PTSD, or something else. And in the 1930s, these conditions were far less understood than they are nowadays. And that's not to say that we've reached the pinnacle of mental health treatment, because we absolutely have not. Things obviously have improved from where we were almost 100 years ago, but it was only the other day that I saw a news item, and it was a really concerned mother of a child who had a severe mental illness, and she'd been trying to contact the authorities for ages, telling them that her son was a danger and that she wanted to keep both him safe and the public at large safe, and she had basically been ignored.
You ring an ambulance, they tell you to ring the police, and it just goes round and round in a circle, and you just do not get any help. You just can't believe it, that they can leave someone so vulnerable in the community with no care. They're seen as a drain on resources. They're too complex. They won't comply. I feel broken. My heart's breaking, and it's wrong. He deserves to be looked after.
So I feel like we understand some mental health conditions better than we did back then, but we are nowhere near where we probably should be. While in custody in Pittsburgh, Frances was visited by an attorney named Louise McBride. She actually represented the Wellesley College Alumni Association and had been instructed by them to provide Frances with legal counsel. It's unclear what they discussed, and Louisa reportedly only had a few minutes to confer with Frances. But it was clear that Frances was going to have some top-notch legal representation. From what I could ascertain, Frances was kept in a cell in Pittsburgh that evening, and she made a somewhat cryptic comment to Assistant DA Coughlin before settling down for the night. Apparently, she had turned to him and said, "It certainly will be a joke if they put me in the electric chair. Perhaps I should say it would be a travesty." That was to be Frances's final evening in Pittsburgh, as the next morning they began the 4-hour journey back to the scene of the crime. Little did they know, it was to be an incredibly revealing journey.
In the time of my confession, in the hour of my
After driving for about an hour and a half, the police, along with Assistant DA Coughlin and Frances, decided to make a stop at Mundy's Corner for lunch, where they ordered Frances ice cream for dessert. It was this small act of kindness that allegedly prompted an unexpected confession, with Frances saying, "I didn't like you at first, but now I do, and I want to tell you all about it." Who knew that all it would take was a bowl of ice cream to get her talking? I mean, we really should have all known, because ice cream is the key to everything. It's the greatest food that's ever been made. Now, I'm not sure exactly what was said over that dinner table or how much information that she gave, but we know that that is where she confessed. And after the meal, they drove her back to Wilkes-Barre, where she was held overnight. That evening, District Attorney Thomas M. Lewis issued a statement.
"We are satisfied that Mrs. Thompson killed Miss Dilley on Friday, March 3rd, between the hours of 8 and 9 o'clock.
The next morning, County Detective John Dempsey took Frances into town to purchase items from a drugstore. Apparently, she was recognised by a former classmate of hers from Wellesley College, and according to the press, they had a friendly conversation. Now, I wonder whether that was actually a common occurrence to take your suspect into town to go shopping. I feel like that doesn't happen anymore, and maybe for good reason. Later on that day, DA Lewis and other county and city officials took Frances back to the scene of the crime at Minnie's home in Fortyford. They had also invited several members of the local press to witness her confession in the very same spot where she had taken Minnie's life. It's all very macabre. And it's also kind of unethical. I mean, I don't know how Minnie's family must have felt about having Frances back in Minnie's home. If that was my loved one, I would have said absolutely not. But I don't know what happened, so I'm not going to judge or comment. According to their own reports, the press had no idea that Frances was actually going to be at the house with her newly acquired attorney, John Dando. The press had actually been driven from the DA's office to Minnie Dilley's home in official vehicles. And when they got there, they were obviously surprised to see her. I mean, can you imagine just walking in and the main suspect is sat right there, about to tell you everything? Absolutely bonkers. And again, I just wonder about the ethics of it. You're bringing in the woman that's confessed to murdering Minnie Dilley. You're bringing her back into Minnie's home. She's sitting on Minnie's furniture in the very room where she murdered her. It just don't sit right. It doesn't sit right for me. And you're doing it to hold a press conference. It's just giving me the ick. I get to throw in my catchphrase here, but that's just me. That's just my opinion. And who am I? I am just a person on the internet talking to a camera. Minnie's neighbours had also found out about this strange press conference, and the newspapers reported that large crowds had shown up to get a glimpse of Minnie's killer. I mean, again, can you imagine if this was happening next door to you? I mean, if Minnie was your next door neighbour and you were suddenly told that the person that had murdered her was coming to hold a press conference. Frances refused to have her photograph taken, and she wouldn't even talk until the photographers left the room. When they did, Frances described how she had travelled to the town of Fortyfort by hitchhiking, and it seemed like her entire story about how she'd spent her days wandering the department stores in Pittsburgh was a lie. She then gave a detailed description of the crime. I came here last Thursday afternoon. I waited on the porch for the old lady for about 2 hours, but she did not appear. I slept most of that night in the Lehigh Valley station in Wilkes-Barre, and on Friday morning, soon after 8 o'clock, I came here again. Miss Dilley answered the side door and admitted me. I seated myself near the fireplace and asked her to sit beside me. I told her I'm here to be friendly with you, but she would not sit beside me, and she remained by the fireplace. I could see that it was a case of her life or mine. I struck her on the head with the bottle of ginger ale. She fell and her head struck the andiron in front of the fireplace. After I saw that I had rendered her unconscious, I pulled the knife from the umbrella in which I had carried it from Pittsburgh. I then cut her throat as a last-minute precaution. I wanted to make sure. I saw that I had accomplished my purpose, and I left by the same door I had entered. I hid the ginger ale bottle by the side of the house and tossed the knife into the river. After her confession, D.A. Lewis pulled out a paper envelope in front of the press, opening it to reveal some red glass beads.
Are these your beads?
Yes, they're mine.
Where did you lose them?
I don't know. I had them when I came to Wilkes-Barre, but missed them when I was on my way home. I have no idea where I lost them. As it turned out, she had actually lost them in the Dilley home, another piece of evidence that proved that she was there. The police then revealed that there were also witnesses that had spotted a woman with a limp, a woman that matched Frances's description, outside the Dilley home. After the murder, she had hitchhiked all the way back to Pittsburgh. She'd stopped at a diner in Edwardsville for a root beer and had shown up at the home of the Backinger family in Bloomsburg asking for food. Then she had arrived back in Pittsburgh on the Saturday evening and had picked up the children like nothing had ever happened, and like she hadn't left a massive trail of evidence that would quickly lead the police right to her doorstep. Judging by the later reports, the press had a hard time wrapping their heads around the fact that Frances was mentally ill and suffering from hallucinations. They wrote that she was from good breeding, as if that could stop someone from developing a mental illness. She was well educated, her family were seemingly well off and respected in the community, and yet here she was admitting to a brutal murder with no sense of remorse.
How have you slept since the murder?
I slept like a top, both before and after this. I had an unusually delightful sleep last night, and I've been given the best care and treatment. It was a strange story, and the press were desperate for a motive, one that could allow them to print even more sensational headlines. And boy, did they get it.
I have heard rumors all over town.
When the police searched Minnie's home, they found 2 threatening letters that were dated March 31st and had been sent from Pittsburgh with Frances as the sender. They were described as rambling and incoherent and clearly indicated the workings of a disordered brain. As I mentioned earlier, Minnie had been receiving these bizarre and unsettling letters for quite some time, and it was later revealed that she had received more than 100 of them. Their contents were disturbing. They accused Minnie of practicing witchcraft, of wanting to establish a so-called love cult with herself as the head, and of trying to procure Frances's husband to join. Frances had actually gone so far as to complain to the police in Pittsburgh, telling them that Minnie was trying to steal her husband. The police actually investigated, but they they eventually found her complaint to be unfounded. It was this incident, combined with the large stack of letters that had accumulated over the course of 4 years, that had helped lead the investigators in Fortyford directly to Frances. As it turned out, Minnie had given the letters to a neighbour for safekeeping, instructing them to share the letters with the police if anything ever happened to her. Now, Frances didn't just write letters to Minnie, she also sent them to the Dilley family, including Minnie's brother. Your sister, Minnie Dilley, is and has been for the last 4 years breaking up my home. I have 2 children, aged 5 and 6, and a husband with whom I was perfectly happy and who was a good provider until your sister took a strange, unholy fancy for him. She's tempted him with money. She wants my husband, 33 years old, to come to her to live in a kingdom of their own. She will send him to college, make a second Edison of him. And if she can't get him without my children, why, she'll take the children too. But she prefers him alone. He must let her manage all of his affairs, business and social, and I, his lawful wife, must be eliminated. He loves me, strange to say, but not as much as this opium dream, as it were, of your sister. According to Frances, Minnie was scheming with her own husband, Carl, to have her locked away in an institution so that he could join her cult as a high priest. I walked in and told Miss Dilley that I wished to discuss this cult which was breaking up my home. I wanted to inform her that Carl must not become her high priest as planned. While I talked, I sat on the sofa and she sat in the chair by the fireplace. I could sense in greater degree than ever before the mental power of this woman that had enslaved my husband, and it was reaching out for me. It was then I decided that only physical force could free me from a living death. Frances even claimed that this love cult that Carl was being tapped to head up included many prominent people in the town of Fortyford. When Carl was eventually questioned about the allegations by the press, he vehemently denied them.
The voice in which she believed has been talking to her for the past 2 or 3 years, but the first I heard of the love cult warnings was a few months ago. The voices, my wife said, advised her that Miss Dilley was to head a colony of free love to be located in New York City. They told her I was to be Miss Dilley's chief aide in the work. Miss Dilley was the last woman on earth who would have been interested in using her money to establish a freak organization, and I am the last man who would have been drawn into it. I tried to tell my wife she was letting a voice out of the air spoil her life, but she wouldn't listen to me.
Despite there being zero evidence of any love cult whatsoever, it was a story that the press couldn't resist. Minnie Dilley's murder was no longer due to a woman experiencing delusions that had influenced her to act out violently. It was a witchcraft murder mystery and a cult murder. They wrote about the supposed occult influence that Minnie held over Carl and the allegations that she practiced witchcraft, but this was all complete nonsense. None of it ever existed, and it was all a product of Frances's mental illness. Now, I doubt that any of this is surprising. We know that the media will glom onto any angle that makes for a sensational headline, and back in the 1930s, a story of witchcraft and free love would have been sure to raise some eyebrows. In his article on anti-cult scares, Professor of History Philip Jenkins writes, "In the decade after 1925, there was a revival of the ancient idea that magicians adhered to an alternative pagan religion linked to devil worship and human sacrifice. At first, this was a purely literary and academic construct associated with authors like H.P. Lovecraft and his colleagues at the magazine Weird Tales. But by the late 1930s, ritual murder charges were being explored with some seriousness, and and appeared as speculations in some notorious serial murder investigations. Minnie had been at the receiving end of these unfounded love cult allegations for years and had reported them to the post office. She had also written to the postmaster in Long Island in an attempt to obtain Frances's parents' address, hoping that they could do something to stop the constant influx of letters and harassment. It was alleged that she received up to 5 letters a week from Frances, and nobody seemed to be able to stop them. The Luzerne County detective, John Dempsey, would later say in the December 1931 issue of True Detective Mystery magazine,
"The investigation failed to reveal a blemish on Minnie Dilley's reputation. She had lived a spotless life, doing good work wherever she could. Her cruel murder was solely due to the workings of a diseased and tortured imagination."
Just remember that death is not the end.
A day after her confession, Frances appeared in court, and according to an article by Marlin Bressie at Pennsylvania Oddities, there was such a large crowd of gawkers and reporters at the courthouse that officials were forced to devise a novel method of delivering Miss Dilley's killer to Judge McLean's courtroom on the 3rd floor without obstruction. Frances Thompson was lifted through the ground floor window by Detective Dempsey, who then walked her around the building to a little used basement entrance. She was whisked onto an elevator in the basement and delivered to the 3rd floor. According to Dempsey, the young woman was highly amused by this treatment. As Frances sat next to her husband and mother, the stenographer read her confession aloud to the court. As far as I know, Miss Dilley had a plan to have a love cult with my husband as the presiding man for the purpose of health, supposedly for women who are teaching and for business reasons cannot have husbands, but must go and hire a man to come and take care of them occasionally. I deliberately severed her throat, just as you would a chicken if you were fixing it for dinner, because I didn't dare let her live and didn't dare let her suffer. Either she or I was going. I don't think it can be proved, but it was entirely in self-defense. I suppose if there is any help, it will be by me pleading insanity. But I'm not insane. I was merely fighting for my life. I'm in great danger, I suppose, by saying it, because it includes a great many people in Fortyford. As far as I know, it is a plan to have a love cult with my husband as the presiding man. Her final ambition was to build a sanitarium, as she called it, our little boarding place, out in the mountains somewhere. The judge ordered Frances to be held without bail, and she was quickly taken to the Luzerne County Prison. For D.A. Lewis, it was obvious that Frances was not fit for trial, and he told the press,
"If the defense does not move for the appointment of a lunacy commission, I will do so. There is no use placing an insane woman on trial, and I am satisfied that Mrs. Thompson is insane."
The local news reported that Frances spent most of her time in the prison library, and she was visited by her husband and her parents, as well as a local reverend and her attorney, John Dando. A sanity commission was quickly assembled, and it consisted of 3 people: Dr. George Basket, who was the superintendent of the Retreat Mental Hospital, Dr. Stanley Freeman, the physician at the Luzerne County Prison, and attorney Joseph E. Flights. All 3 of them agreed that Frances was suffering from a mental illness that was causing delusions and hallucinations. Her own testimony was used as evidence for her condition, and when she was questioned, she actually told the commission that there had been mental illness in her family. An uncle of hers had been treated in a facility, but it was never really reported for what reason. On May 1st, she was committed to the Retreat Mental Hospital, and she was finally taken there 7 days later. Although the case case had been closed, there was still significant interest in the financial dealings of Minnie Dilley. The newspapers reported on the contents of her will and the value of her estate, which was $22,000 if you were wondering. Quite a lot of money back in the 1930s. Quite a lot of money now, actually. The press made a big deal about how her finances weren't as great as everyone had claimed, but $22,000 back then would be around $500,000 today. So she was not bad off by any stretch of the imagination. Minnie left $10,000 to be invested into a trust fund for her brother Sherman. He was to receive the net income from it during his life. The rest of her money was left to various charities and churches in Wilkes-Barre, including the Home for Homeless Women, the local children's home, and the Women's Home Missionary Society, who themselves released a touching statement. "We're the undersigned district officers of the Women's Home Missionary Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church, keenly feeling the loss of Miss Minnie Dilley, hereby express our sympathy to the family and publicly voice our sorrow. We represent 2,880 Christian women interested in home missionary work, who, for the last 18 years, have been faithfully served by Miss Dilley as treasurer of our organisation. She was most efficient and gave of her time unsparingly to the work that she loved. Her liberality helped greatly to further the cause that we represent. We deeply regret her passing, and her presence will sadly be missed in our councils." Although Minnie's murder was covered in a December issue of True Detective magazine, there was very little left to report on. It had been a fairly open and shut case, and Frances had been committed. There was little chance that she would ever leave the facility. In March 1934, the press reported that Frances was seriously ill. It was a report that was then confirmed by Dr. Basket, who said that her condition was considerably worse than when she was committed, although he never elaborated on what that condition actually was. During my research, I couldn't find anything specific about the treatment that Frances received at the facility, but given what we know historically about mental health treatment in the 1930s, it was most likely not great. According to an article by Shanna Freeman, treatment consisted of sedatives and hot and cold baths, as well as so-called insulin therapy. There was a belief that injecting these substances into the body could quite literally shock a patient out of being mentally ill. Some patients were given up to 60 doses of insulin over the course of several months until they were comatose. They would then be revived by a doctor and monitored. And you won't be surprised to hear that there were tremendous risks involved in this kind of treatment, including brain damage, heart failure, and even death. Now, I'm aware that Frances killed someone, and what she did was horrific, but she was also suffering from a serious illness in a time where the only proposed treatment was putting you in a bath or a coma. Now, like I said, I'm not sure what treatment she actually received, and I'm not going to speculate, but it wouldn't be a stretch of the imagination to think that perhaps her so-called treatment led to a deterioration of her health. Frances lived until the 15th of March 1940. She died just a few weeks after her 41st birthday. The death certificate listed the cause as pulmonary tuberculosis. Her death wasn't publicly announced, and it was only discovered after an off-the-cuff remark by Dr. Basket during a court session. He claimed that she had been in very bad health, both mentally and physically, for a long time before she had died. He also said that her parents had travelled from New Jersey to claim her body, and she was eventually laid to rest in the Oakwood Cemetery in Wisconsin, the state where she was born. I debated for a while whether I wanted to actually cover this case or not. I came across it on newspapers.com a few months ago, and the initial newspaper headlines grabbed me because they were incredibly salacious, but the more that I researched into it, obviously the truth began to appear. And I've got a lot of mixed feelings about true true crime stories and the ethics of making videos of podcasts about horrific crimes that have happened. But then I also think that this is history, and people like Minnie Dilley should be remembered, not for being the spinster victim of a so-called love cult killing like the press made her out to be, but for being a woman who seemed to care deeply about her local community and gave her time and money to causes that were incredibly important to her and close to her heart. It's also important, in my opinion, to learn from history. And in almost all of these cases, we find that more could and should have been done to protect the victim. Remember, Minnie reported this harassment. She reported it to almost everyone. The police knew about it. The Postmaster General knew about it. Francis's parents knew about it. Francis's husband knew about it. Even Francis's family were seemingly trying to do something about it. And yet nothing seemed to be done. Despite all of those people knowing, and despite having a mountain of evidence in the form of threatening letters, Francis was left free to roam the streets with horrific and fatal results. So that's all I got. I hope that you found the research that I did interesting. And let me know what you think about this case. And let me know what you think about kind of the ethics of covering crime stories. Because a lot of the stories that I cover on this channel are crime stories and there are victims. But I very rarely cover cases that involve somebody dying, somebody being killed. So that's where this is different. But it's a historical case. I hadn't seen it covered on YouTube before, and I thought it was compelling. I thought Minnie was compelling as a person, and if I can go even a little way of keeping her memory alive, then it was all worth it. As always, thank you to my wonderful patrons, and thank you for your patience as I've been putting this video together. As some of you know, I had a death in the family recently of somebody that was very close to me, and it's been a bit of a struggle. It's not been a good couple of months, but I'm trying to get back on the horse, get back on the wagon. I'm getting back on something that's moving. If you want to become a patron, you can do so at the link in the description. You'll get early access to videos, you get to join our Discord server, you can see some of my old videos that I have unlisted because I find them quite embarrassing. There are patron only videos that are on there. There's patron only audio stuff. There's interviews with people that I've done, people like Rick Doty, all kinds of interesting things going on the Patreon. So if you want to do that, go over, join the Patreon. You would literally make my day. And I will see you in the next video. Bye.